The door didn't break. That was the worst part. It opened cleanly, quietly, the way a door opens when someone has a key they were never supposed to keep. And Steve Addo stepped inside Gia's apartment like he still owned the air in it. He didn't turn the lights on. He knew the layout. 3 years of a shared flat in Brixton had mapped this kind of space into his muscle memory. Where the kitchen started, where the hallway narrowed, how many steps before the living room opened up. He moved through the dark with the ease of a man who had spent years making himself at home in places that had quietly stopped welcoming him. He set the flowers on the kitchen counter. White lilies. Her favorite once. He'd remembered. He always remembered the small things. That was part of it, part of what made him so hard to leave, so hard to explain to people who hadn't lived inside it. He remembered her favorite flowers and her favorite song, and exactly how hard to squeeze before something cracked. He straightened his jacket, rolled his neck. "All right, G," he said quietly to the empty apartment. "Let's see how this goes." He wasn't alone. He didn't know that yet. The man at the kitchen table had been still for so long he'd become part of the room. No phone in his hand, no drink, just sitting with the particular patience of someone who had learned, very early, that stillness was its own kind of power. He'd heard the door. He'd heard the footsteps. He'd done the calculation in under a second and decided with complete calm to wait. Hanya June waited. Steve moved further into the apartment and reached for the lamp switch on the far wall. The light came on. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Steve's hand was still on the switch. He hadn't moved it. Couldn't, quite. Because the man at Gia's kitchen table was looking at him with an expression that wasn't threatening, wasn't angry, wasn't anything that Steve had a clean word for. And that was somehow worse than all three. He was dressed like money that didn't need to prove itself. Dark jacket, open collar, completely at ease in a chair that wasn't his, in an apartment he had no visible reason to be in. He looked, Steve thought, with a creeping unease he didn't want to name, like a man who had never once been surprised by anything. "Close the door," the man said. "You're letting the heat out." Steve's jaw tightened. He closed the door. He didn't know why he did it. "Who are you?" Before you read any further, if you love Afro-Korean stories that hit different, subscribe and turn on your notifications. You will not want to miss where this one goes. Now. Let's get into it. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at Steve the way someone looks at a maths problem they've already solved, with mild, retrospective interest. Then he tilted his head very slightly and said, "You came a long way." "I asked you a question." "You did," the man agreed. Steve crossed his arms. He was not a small person. He'd always used that, the size of himself, the way he could fill a doorframe, the way people recalibrated when he stepped into a room. It had worked, reliably, his entire adult life. It was working less well right now, and he couldn't explain why. "This is my girlfriend's apartment." "Ex-girlfriend," the man said, quiet, factual. The word landed with a precision that made Steve's eye twitch. "Does she know you're here?" The man looked at him steadily. "Does she know you are?" Gia had been thinking about noodles for 40 minutes. That was the honest, embarrassing truth of what was in her head as she came through the building lobby at 9:15 on a Tuesday. Not anything profound. Not the deadline she'd pushed through at the studio. Not the text from her mum she'd been meaning to answer for 3 days. Just noodles. The specific kind from the Pojangmacha, 2 streets over, that she allowed herself on evenings that had been long in the particular way Tuesdays were always long. She had a bag from the convenience store, ramen, 2 cans of peach soju, a face mask she would probably not use. A quiet evening, a rare and specific kind of peace. She pressed the button for the 9th floor and leaned against the elevator wall and exhaled. The elevator doors opened. She stepped into the hallway and stopped. Her door was closed. Nothing visibly wrong. But something in the air on the floor had a quality she couldn't name, a stillness that wasn't the usual kind. The kind that meant something had recently moved through it. She stood for a moment in the hallway with her bag and her ramen and her face mask, and she waited for the feeling to resolve into nothing. It didn't. She walked to her door, touched the handle, took a breath. She opened it. The first thing she registered was Steve. The second thing she registered was that Steve was very, very still. The third thing she registered, in a way that didn't fully land for another 3 seconds, was why. Gia. Steve's voice came out wrong, too controlled, like a man working to sound normal. He turned toward her, and she watched him perform the smile, that specific smile, the one that had taken her 18 months of therapy to stop responding to, but it didn't reach anything above his mouth. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. There you are. I was just... Steve. Her voice came out flat, bloodless. The convenience store bag was still in her hand. She hadn't moved from the doorway. What are you doing in my apartment? Not a question. She'd stopped asking Steve questions a long time ago. I just wanted to talk. How did you get in? Gia, come on. How did you get in, Steve? He spread his hands, reasonable, patient. That was the performance. Always the reasonable one, always the patient one. And she, the unreasonable woman, overreacting to a man who'd flown 20 hours just to apologize. I still had a key. I know I should have... You've never been to this apartment. The smile faltered, just slightly. I had a copy made before you left. I was going to tell you. The room was very quiet. Gia's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, to the man at her kitchen table. She'd been aware of him in the peripheral way you're aware of something that doesn't belong, that your brain is still processing. Now she looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that she couldn't have put language to, a recognition, some kind. Silent transaction she didn't fully understand yet. She knew his face. Elevator, lobby, midnight fire drill, the almost smile. She did not know his name or what he was doing in her kitchen, and her brain was currently holding all of it suspended while her body stayed completely still. Steve's eyes moved between them, and that was when something shifted in his face. He looked at the man at the table, really looked, the way he hadn't when he first turned the light on, and some color drained from his expression so cleanly it was almost visible. His chin came up, his jaw worked. No, he said, barely above a whisper. Not to Gia, to no one almost, like a man correcting a terrible calculation. No, that's not... He looked at Gia, then back at the man, then at Gia again. Do you know who that is? He said. And for the first time in the 3 years she'd known Steve Addo, through the charm and the threats and the hospital and all of it, she heard something in his voice that she had never once heard before. Steve was afraid. Gia, he said, do you know who is sitting in your kitchen? The man at the table hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression. He looked at Steve with the same calm, settled patience he'd had since the lights came on, and he said very quietly, Close the door, Gia. The sound of her name in his mouth was the strangest thing that had happened all evening, and everything that had happened all evening was extraordinary. She closed the door. Steve's fear lasted exactly as long as it took him to remember he didn't come this far to be afraid. Gia watched it happen in real time, watched him recalibrate, watched the old architecture reassemble behind his eyes, that specific restructuring she knew better than she knew most things. Steve afraid was dangerous in a different way than Steve confident. Confidence she could predict. Fear made him reach for something to break. He turned to her fully. How long? He said. What? How long has this been going on? He gestured at the man at the table with a kind of controlled violence. Not a point, almost a shove at the air. Because I call, you don't answer. I text, nothing. I fly out here and you've got... Steve. Some man sitting in your flat in the dark like that's normal. Steve. Her voice stayed flat. She had learned, at great cost, that any emotion she showed him became a tool. There is nothing going on, I don't know why he's here, and you need to leave. I'm not going anywhere. You broke into my apartment. I have a key that I never gave you. She set the convenience store bag down on the floor because her arm had started to shake, and she refused to let him see it. You made a copy of a key to an apartment you've never been to, flew to Seoul without telling me, and let yourself in. That is not romantic, Steve. That is a crime. Something moved across his face. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was a thing she recognized the way you recognize a smell. Instantly, physically, before the brain catches up. Lower your voice, he said. I'm not raising it. Gia. I'm not raising it, she said again, steadier. And you're going to leave. He took a step toward her. Ye-jun stood up. It was a simple thing. He didn't say anything. He didn't move toward Steve. He simply stood, and the act of it, the shift from seated to standing, the full height of him, the absolute lack of urgency in it, changed the geometry of the room entirely. Steve stopped, not because he chose to, because his body made the decision before his pride could override it. The two men looked at each other. I know who you are, Steve said. His voice had dropped. The performance was gone. What was left was something rawer and uglier. I've heard your name. I know what you are. Then you know, Ye-jun said pleasantly, that you should sit down. I'm not sitting down in her. It wasn't a suggestion. The quiet in the room had weight to it now. Gia stood near the door and felt it pressing against her chest, and watched Steve do the thing he always did when cornered. Go still for just a moment, like a current running just beneath the surface, and then make a choice that proved every bad thing anyone had ever thought about him. He grabbed her arm. It happened fast. One moment she was standing by the door, and the next his hand was around her wrist, and he was pulling her toward him with the casual force of a man who had done it before, who knew exactly how much pressure to use, who had a whole vocabulary built around this specific action. We're going to talk, he said into her face. You and me. Whatever this is. A jerk of his chin at Ye-jun. It can wait. Gia didn't make a sound. That was the thing that changed Ye-jun's face. Not the grab. Not the pull. The silence. The way she went quiet and internal, the way something does when it has learned that sound doesn't help. He had seen that silence before in his life, and he had sworn the first time he saw it that he would never stand still in front of it again. He crossed the room. What happened next lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Ye-jun moved without announcement, without escalation, with the clean efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped wasting motion on anger. Steve's grip on Gia's wrist was broken first. A precise redirect that turned Steve's own, momentum against him. Then Steve was moving, not of his own choice, across the kitchen and into the wall beside the refrigerator, one arm locked at an angle that suggested very clearly it could go further, and would, if given a reason. Ye-jun's forearm was across Steve's collarbone, not his throat, specifically not his throat, a distinction that said, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm choosing what I do and don't do. And he was very close to Steve's ear. He spoke quietly. The words didn't carry. Gia stood in the spot Steve had pulled her from and pressed her back teeth together and breathed through her nose. Her wrist ached in the specific way it had ached before, and the familiarity of that sensation moved through her like something cold, and she refused, absolutely refused, to cry in front of either of them. Steve's free hand had come up instinctively, a fist half-formed, and then lowered. Slowly. She watched him lower it, and she understood in a way she couldn't have articulated cleanly that it wasn't Ye-jun's strength that made him do it. It was something Ye-jun had said. Those few quiet words she hadn't heard. Whatever they were, Steve believed them the way he'd never believed anything she'd ever said to him in 3 years. His eyes found hers over Ye-jun's shoulder. She didn't look away. She was done looking away. The flowers are on the counter, she said. Her voice came out clean. She was proud of that. Take them when you go. Steve said nothing. Ye-jun stepped back. Slowly. Smoothed his jacket with one hand. He turned away from Steve with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement, the turn of a man who no longer considers you a threat worth monitoring, and that dismissal, she could see, cut Steve somewhere deeper than the wall had. Steve grabbed the flowers off the counter, the lilies. He didn't take them because she'd said to. He took them because his hands needed something to hold, and she knew that too. Knew all his tells, had spent years learning them the way you learn the sounds a house makes in a storm. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle, and she knew he was going to say something. He always needed the last word, needed to leave something behind in a room that would stay after he did. And she braced for it. He looked at Yejun instead of her. "You don't know what you're involved in," he said, low, almost steady. "Any of it." Yejun looked at him with an expression that might, in a certain light, have been sympathy. "Good night, Steve." The door closed. The silence that replaced him was a completely different kind, softer around the edges. Gia stood in the middle of her apartment in her coat, with her keys still in her hand and the convenience store bag on the floor, and she took one breath, then another, and looked at the ceiling and did not cry. "Your wrist," Yejun said. "It's fine." "Gia." "I said it's fine." She lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him, and something in his expression made it harder to hold herself together, which was the opposite of what she needed right now. She needed him to be cold. She needed him to be hard and transactional so she had something to push against. Instead, he was looking at her the way people looked at her when they knew, when they'd figured out that what happened in London wasn't just a bad relationship, wasn't just a rough patch, wasn't just one of those things. And the gentleness of it was almost unbearable. "How did you get into my apartment?" she said. He answered her the same way he had in the outline, clean, direct, no dressing on it. "I own the building." Gia looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't just seeing, it was recalculating. He watched her do it, watched her take the thing she'd just heard and run it backwards through every interaction, every maintenance request answered within the hour, every time the lobby felt just slightly too attentive, every elevator ride where the doors seemed to open a beat before she pressed the button. "You own the building," she repeated. "Yes." "This building, the one I have lived in for 2 years." "Yes." "And you let yourself into my apartment with, what, a master key?" "It's my building." "That is not an answer." "It's the accurate one." She pulled her coat off in one sharp motion and dropped it over the back of the sofa, and Yejun had the particular self-awareness to recognize that the action was not about being warm. She was putting her hands to work so they didn't shake. He recognized that too. "So the fire drill," she said. He said nothing. "The heat. February 2 in the morning, it broke, and it was fixed by 5. That was you." "That was my maintenance team." "Because you told them to." He didn't confirm or deny it. She read the silence correctly. "The parking garage," she said. "The man who helped with my tire. He works for me. And you were just there, standing there, in the garage at 11 at night." "I was working." "In the garage." "I work in many places." Gia pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed. Yejun stayed where he was, near the kitchen counter, not crowding her, not retreating. He'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in a room with someone who needed space was move unpredictably. You stayed visible. You stayed still. You let them set the distance. "Why are you here tonight?" she said. Specifically. Not the building. Not the master key. Why tonight? Why this apartment? Why were you sitting in my kitchen in the dark? He could have given her a half-truth. He was good at half-truths, had built a significant portion of his professional life on their careful application. He looked at her standing in the middle of her apartment in the light, wrists still faintly reddened from Steve's grip, and he found, with something approaching irritation at himself, that he didn't want to give her one. "There's something in this apartment that doesn't belong to you," he said. The room changed, not visibly, but something shifted in Gia's posture, Not fear, something more alert than fear, something that was almost entirely intelligence. "What kind of something?" she said slowly. "A drive, USB. It would have been left here without your knowledge, probably somewhere low traffic. Junk drawer, bathroom cabinet." She moved before he finished the sentence. He watched her cross to the kitchen, pull open the drawer beside the refrigerator, push aside the dead charger, the takeout menus, the hair tie, and the batteries, and the 3 pens that probably didn't work, and stop. She stood there with her hand in the drawer and stared at the space where something had been. When she turned around, her expression had changed entirely. The controlled anger from a moment ago had sharpened into something more precise and significantly more dangerous. "It was there," she said. "Yes. It's been there for 6 weeks. I thought it was Steve's. I thought he'd forgotten some old—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "You took it?" "Yes." "That's why you were here. That is specifically why you were sitting in my kitchen tonight. Not because of me, because of whatever is on that drive." "Yes," he said again. He wasn't going to dress it up. She laughed. It was a short, humorless sound, the kind that means the person making it is too tired to be as angry as they deserve to be. She put both hands flat on the kitchen counter and looked at the drawer and then looked at the ceiling, and Ye-Jun watched the thoughts move across her face like weather. "Steve left it here," she said. Not a question anymore. "Yes." "He wasn't here for closure." "No. He came back for the drive." "That would be my read." She was quiet for a moment. "What's on it?" "That's not something I'm going to tell you." "It was in my apartment, Ye-Jun." She stopped, caught herself. His name had come out without decision, and she registered it with a visible flinch, like she'd shown something she hadn't meant to. He didn't react to it. He filed it somewhere quiet and left it alone. "It was in my apartment," she said again, steadier. "Whatever it contains, whatever Steve is involved in, I'm already standing in the middle of it. I deserve to know. What you deserve and what I'm going to tell you aren't the same thing." That's an incredibly arrogant thing to say to someone in their own home. "Probably," he agreed. She stared at him. He looked back. The kitchen light was warm, and the apartment was quiet in the way apartments only are after something loud has just left them, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence had a texture to it, charged, unresolved, not entirely uncomfortable, in a way that neither of them acknowledged. "The emergency contact form," she said quietly. He went still, barely perceptibly, but she caught it. "When I moved in, I listed Steve. His name is on my rental paperwork." Her eyes moved over his face with a careful attention he found disquieting in the specific way that things that are accurate are disquieting. "You saw his name before I ever moved into this building." He said nothing. "You knew who he was. I knew of him. And you let me move in anyway. You weren't in danger from him at the time." "That," she said, with a quietness that was its own kind of fury, "is not your decision to make." "No," he said. "It wasn't." The admission landed differently than she expected. She'd been braced for deflection, for the reconfigured logic that men like him, men like Steve, men like every man who had ever decided her safety was a resource they could manage, usually reached for. The simple acknowledgement of it disarmed her in a way she resented immediately. "I want you to leave," she said. "I'll have someone posted on your floor. I want you to leave, and I want you to not do me any more favors without telling me first." Her voice didn't waver. "I have spent a long time learning the difference between someone who protects you and someone who just decides what you need protecting from. They feel exactly the same from the inside until they don't." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, but the thing adjacent to it that people feel when something true lands harder than they expected. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, moved to the door. "Lock the deadbolt," he said. "Not the standard issue, the one you put in yourself." She said nothing. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then walked to the door and locked both bolts and pressed her back against it and tilted her head up and breathed. Her wrist ached. Her chest ached. The drawer was still open, and the space where the drive had been was still empty, and her apartment felt like a place she didn't entirely recognize. She pushed off the door and moved to the window, and she stopped. 9 floors below, Steve was on the street. He hadn't left. That was the first thing. He was standing on the pavement outside the building's east entrance with the white lilies still in his hand and his phone pressed to his ear, and even from this height, even through glass, she could read his body language the way she'd always been able to read it. The tight set of his shoulders, the way he paced in a short, controlled line, the hand that wasn't holding the phone curled at his side. He was talking fast. Whoever was on the other end was not making him feel better. Gia stood very still at the window. 20 hours on a plane, he'd said. For her. That was the story. The romantic gesture. The man who loved her so much he crossed continents. But she'd known, standing in that doorway with her ramen and her face mask and her soju, that something was wrong with the texture of it. Steve didn't fly 20 hours for people. Steve flew 20 hours for things, for leverage, for retrieval, for a drive sitting in a junk drawer. She watched him pace, and she thought about 6 weeks ago. The knock on her door she almost didn't answer. The version of him that had shown up soft and undone. Eyes red in a way that could have been crying or could have been a very long flight, and she'd never been able to tell the difference. She'd given him 1 hour. She'd sat on the opposite end of the sofa with her arms crossed and let him talk. And he'd talked about London, and about them, and about how much he'd changed, and she'd said almost nothing, because she'd learned that saying nothing was the only response he couldn't use. He'd left before the hour was up. She thought that was a victory. She'd thought wrong. Below, Steve stopped pacing. A car pulled up, not a taxi, not a rideshare, no light on the roof, no phone mounted on the dash. A black saloon, clean, moving with the specific unhurried certainty of a vehicle that knows it won't be bothered. It stopped at the curb and the window came down and Steve leaned in and she couldn't see who was inside. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Steve straightened up. He looked up at the building. Not at her window specifically, just up, the way you look at something you're calculating. And then he got in. The car moved into traffic and was gone. Gia stood at the window for a long time after the street was empty. Then she picked up her phone and called Nadia. Nadia had known about London from the beginning, had been the one to drive her to the airport when she left, had held her hand through the paperwork, had never once said, "I told you so," even though she had told her so. Twice, clearly. In the kind and devastating way that only a best friend can. If anyone deserved to know that Steve had just materialized in Seoul, it was her. The call didn't connect. Gia frowned, tried again. The tone ran out into nothing, not voicemail, not even the click of a failed connection, just silence. And then the quiet of her own apartment pressing back at her. She lowered the phone slowly. The door knocked, not loudly. 3 measured knocks, spaced evenly, the way someone knocks when they're not trying to startle you. She crossed to the door and put her hand flat against it, an old habit, feeling for something she couldn't have named. "It's me," Yejun said. She unbolted both locks. He was in the hallway with his jacket over one arm and his phone in his hand, and he looked, for the first time since she'd walked into her apartment and found her evening completely dismantled, like someone who had received information he didn't like. "I saw the car," she said. "I know. My security sent me the plate." He paused. "Can I come in?" It wasn't the kind of question that expected to be refused, but it wasn't the kind that demanded either. It sat somewhere in between, and she recognized the difference and stepped aside. He came in, and she closed the door, and they stood. In her hallway, which was not a large hallway, and the proximity was different now than it had been before. The anger had moved somewhere else, and what remained in its place was something more complicated that she didn't want to examine directly. "Who was in the car?" she said. "People who want what was in your drawer." "And Steve called them from my street." "Steve called them from your street." "So he didn't come here just for me." "No." She nodded slowly. She'd already known. Saying it out loud was just the formality of it. Was he ever going to leave without the drive? Ye-jun looked at her steadily. No. And if you hadn't been here? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She understood, with a cold and clarifying certainty, that Steve's soft knock and his white lilies and his 20-hour flight had a contingency built into it from the beginning. A version of the evening where she said no to the conversation, where she told him to leave, where the warmth didn't work. She'd known Steve for 3 years, and she understood what his contingencies looked like, and she was standing in her hallway, understanding it all at once, and it was a lot to hold without letting her face do something she'd regret. Gia, I'm fine. You keep saying that. Because I am. She looked up at him. I have been fine through significantly worse than tonight, Ye-jun. I don't need you to... I'm not trying to manage you, he said, quiet, direct. I know you said that before, and I'm not. I came back because your phone is being blocked. She went still. What? The number you just tried to call. The signal drop. It's not a coincidence. It's a tap. Someone put it on your line in the last 30 minutes. He paused. While Steve was standing on your street. The phone in her hand felt different suddenly. Heavier, like an object she didn't fully trust anymore. They can do that, she said. Less a question than a thing she was absorbing. The people Steve is running for can do quite a lot. She set the phone face down on the hallway table, looked at her hand for a moment, looked at him. What do they want with the drive? Names, financial records, things they can use. Against you. He didn't confirm it. There are people on that drive, she said carefully, who didn't choose to be on it. Something shifted behind his eyes, just slightly. She filed it away. Yes, he said. Family. The word landed between them, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Unguarded, for just a fraction of a second. The kind of unguarded that happens before a person realizes they've let it through. Then it was gone, but she'd seen it. I had no idea, she said. I need you to know that. Whatever Steve brought into this building, whatever he was using my apartment for, I had no idea. I know that. I don't want you to have any doubt about that. Gia, his voice was low. I know. She exhaled. The tension in her shoulders released by some small degree, and she leaned back against the hallway wall and looked at him, standing in her narrow hallway with his jacket over his arm, and she thought about the elevator, about the lobby, about the midnight fire drill and the almost smile, about 2 years of proximity that had felt coincidental and apparently wasn't entirely. And she thought about the fact that his name in her mouth had come out easy and natural, like a word she'd been saving up. The fire drill, she said. You really were just there. I couldn't sleep. You said you were working. I was thinking, I do it while I walk. At midnight. I keep strange hours. She studied him. And the tire. You were going to be late. You didn't know where I was going. No, he said. But you looked like someone who couldn't afford to be late. It was such a specific thing to notice, such a precise and quiet piece of attention, the kind that didn't announce itself, and she felt it move through her chest like something warm and inconvenient. This is a very complicated situation, she said. Yes. You broke into my apartment. Technically. You broke into my apartment. You knew who my ex-boyfriend was before I moved in. There is a drive full of information people are willing to tap my phone for, and Steve just got into a car I've never seen before and is somewhere in this city right now. Yes, he said. That's accurate. And you came back? Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. The hallway was very still. Outside the window, the city moved on in its ordinary late evening way, unbothered, and in here everything felt suspended. Because I didn't want you to be alone with all of it, he said. And I couldn't make that make sense as a professional decision, so I stopped trying. The hallway held that sentence for a long moment. Gia looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in 2 years of careful peripheral awareness, and felt the specific vertigo of understanding that something has been true for longer than you knew. She thought about the kind of person who noticed a stranger's tire at 11 at night and said nothing about it afterward, who approved a lease and watched from a distance and came himself instead of sending someone, who sat in a dark apartment for 43 minutes after finding what he came for. You should know, she said carefully, that I am not someone who does well with people who make decisions for me. I know that. I mean it. I didn't survive Steve to walk into something else where someone else decides what I need and when I need it. That's not what this is. You were in my apartment without my knowledge. Yes. And you knew his name was in my file. Yes. Those are not small things, Yejun. No, he said. They're not. And I'm not going to tell you they are. He looked at her steadily. But I came back tonight, and I'm telling you the truth, and I'm standing in your hallway asking permission to be here. That's different. She held his gaze. He didn't look away. She'd noticed that about him in the elevator, that he didn't do the polite social thing of breaking eye contact first, didn't perform discomfort to make her comfortable, just looked at her with that level, patient attention like someone who had decided she was worth the full weight of it. It was the most unsettling thing about him. She was beginning to think it was also her favorite. You can stay, she said, for now. Something in his face settled. Not relief. Something quieter than relief. Like a door easing shut in a house that had been letting the cold in. She pushed off the wall and moved into the kitchen and filled the kettle because she needed something functional to do, and also because she genuinely wanted tea, which felt like the most aggressively normal impulse she'd had all evening. She heard him follow and settle at the table. Her table, the same chair, the same stillness, and she got 2 mugs down from the cabinet without asking if he wanted any. The people in the car, she said, her back to him. What do they do now? They know the drive is gone. They know Santev didn't retrieve it. So they know someone else has it. They'll assume, yes, and they'll come back. Not tonight. But, he confirmed. She turned and set both mugs on the table and sat down across from him. The overhead light was soft, and the city moved outside the window, and in the middle of all of it, they sat across from each other in the ordinary geography of her kitchen, and it felt, absurdly, like the most intimate thing that had happened all evening. What was it like, she said, knowing his name was in your file and watching me live here anyway? He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything, without deflection, without the automatic reach for a more comfortable answer. Complicated, he said. Complicated how? You were safe. He wasn't here. You'd left him, and you'd built something, and it seemed wrong to pull any of that apart for a precaution that might never become necessary. And when it became necessary, I came myself, instead of sending someone. Yes. Why? He looked at his mug, then at her. You know why. She did. That was the problem. She'd known since the hallway, since the almost smile in the lobby, since the way he'd said her name in her own apartment, like it was a word he'd been careful with. She knew, and it frightened her in a completely different way than Steve had ever frightened her. Not the cold animal fear of something closing in, but the wide-open terror of something that might actually be good, that she might reach for and break, that she might let herself need and then be wrong about. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. Whatever this is, I don't know how to do it with someone like you. Someone like me. You know what you are. Yes, he said. And you know what you survived. I'm not going to tell you one cancels the other out. That's a remarkably honest thing to say. I find it's easier. Than what? Then being something I'm not and watching you figure it out later. She looked at him across her kitchen table, the man who owned the walls around her, who carried things she would never fully see, who had stood up in her apartment with a quiet ferocity that had made Steve Addo afraid for the first time in his life. And she thought that in a different version of tonight she was eating noodles alone and watching something on her laptop, and none of this existed yet. She was not sure that version was better. "I need you to tell me things," she said. "Not everything. I understand what you are, and I'm not asking for everything. But the things that touch my life, I need to know them. I need to not be the last person in a room to understand what room I'm standing in." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "Just like that." Just like that. She wrapped both hands around her mug and felt the warmth of it, and sat in the quiet of an evening that had been entirely dismantled and was now something unrecognizable and strange and oddly, terrifyingly full of possibility. Her phone buzzed on the hallway table. They both heard it. Yejun's eyes moved to the hallway. "My team cleared the tap 20 minutes ago." She got up and retrieved the phone. The notification wasn't a call. It was a message. Unknown number, the kind of unknown that wasn't a spam algorithm, but a human choice. A number stripped of any identifier, routed to land clean and cold on her screen. She read it once. Read it again. Her face did something she couldn't stop. Jia. Yejun was standing. She hadn't heard him move. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. 4 words. "I know what's on it." And then a second message arrived in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the room, sitting beneath the first like a door opening into a dark she hadn't known was there. "Ask him about your sister." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Jia looked at Yejun, and Yejun looked at Jia, and the expression on his face, that face she'd spent 2 years reading from elevators and lobbies and careful peripheral glances, was the one thing she hadn't seen yet. Hadn't seen in the car conversation or the apartment, or the confrontation with Steve, or the quiet honesty of the last hour. He looked caught. "Yejun?" she said. Her voice came out very steady. She was proud of that, and also somewhere beneath the steadiness there was something cold uncurling. "What do they mean about my sister?" He didn't answer immediately, and the non-answer was its own answer, and Jia set the phone down on the kitchen table face up between them, and took one step back and looked at the man she'd spent all evening deciding to trust. "Tell me," she said. "Right now. Tell me everything." Outside the window, 9 floors below, a black car had come back. It was parked across the street. Engine off. Lights off. Waiting. "And that is where we are leaving you. I need you to tell me in the comments, do you trust Yejun? Because I'm not sure Jia should. Drop your theories below, share this with someone who needs this story in their life, and if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit that button right now because you don't want to miss out on more.